Hello everybody, Dan TCB, the Criminal Violin here. Welcome to Chatterbox, episode 5, where I talk about whatever it is I wish to talk about at the time. So, today I want to talk about US public transportation. I am a huge transport nerd, and so it's something that I've always averaged spending somewhere anywhere between basically 2 and probably about 4 hours per day, pretty much just about my entire life, thinking about, talking about, researching, reading about. It's just in some way, shape, or form being involved with and being deeply invested in. And not only has my entire life pretty much been centered around having to rely on one of those systems, but also at the same time, I've just been so deeply interested in public transit around the world that I've actually researched public transportation public transportation modes, systems, and just basically all these different details about them all around the world throughout history. And so I feel like I'm always somebody who's kind of an aficionado about public transit, their forms, and everything else, and what is a valid form versus what is not, what is okay and acceptable these days, which is what should never be accepted, and basically why there's a lot of problems versus why there isn't, depending on where you are. This is, of course, a subject that's incredibly boring to so many people, but especially in the US, where the infrastructure is considered a D minus and degrading rapidly because there's just no investment, no talking about it, because it's considered so boring. Or, as literally, if you ask any politician, they'll literally tell you why they never talk about it, why there's no bills or anything about infrastructure, thus transportation, on the table, is because it's considered quote unquote unsexy. It's not sexy enough to be talked about. Nobody wants to hear it, nobody wants to think about it, nobody wants to talk about it, therefore we won't talk about it, and we don't talk about it because it's just not sexy enough to the general public, so we refuse to speak on it. That's why the US is just allowing their infrastructure, their roads, their buildings, their sidewalks, their streetlights, their everything to just decay into a state of utter just ill repair. And public transport is technically a separate sector from infrastructure, but it relies on infrastructure and it uses infrastructure. It requires it to the extent that I feel like public transit, really any kind of transportation, is should be considered, yes, different, but as a sub branch of infrastructure. Either that or see it as both its own separate major thing, but at the same time it also doubles as a substructure, a sub branch of infrastructure. So, that all being said, the US has the most notoriously hideous excuse for public transport systems in the entire world thus far. That includes places like Addis Ababa in Africa, in Ethiopia. And I'm pretty sure I just said that wrong because I'm dyslexic and I also sometimes add or subtract syllables. There's actually a light rail station just up. It's one stop from the one I actually live at, and it's called Katama, but they say it Quatama because the fact it's QU and it's English, so they say Quatama, but I would say Ka because it's probably Latin / Spanish, so I'd say it's Katama. But I always end up calling it Katanama because I add syllables. So if I'm saying things wrong, that's probably what's happening. That or I'm being dyslexic with syllables and things like that. So I apologize for that ahead of time. But there's just places where you'd think that their public transit systems are considered so shitty, and in reality, they're not in comparison to the U.S. They're crappy comparison to a lot of places, say in Europe or Japan or South Korea or in China, but they're not. But in comparison to the U.S., it's really incredibly difficult to be as bad, if not worse, than the U.S.'s transit excuses for transit systems. So one of the big problems with U.S. transport is the fact that the federal government dictates to the state and local governments. The local governments being county and city, or city being called municipal, of course. And that's a huge problem in itself. At the same time, in the U.S., every level is required to run them as corporations, private, multi-governmental corporations. That's what all U.S. transit agencies are multi-governmental corporations at their core. That's exactly what they are. They're founded by the governments, they're ran by the governments, and they run it for profit, which means they're a corporation. They'll always try to just constantly reiterate, we have no, the government says we have nothing to do with the transport. The transport is completely separate from us. We have nothing to do. They're a private entity. Then the supposed private entity of transportation system says, no, yeah, they're right. We're totally separate. We have no government interference. We run completely on our own. We are our own company. There's no government there at all. And in reality, it's intensely easy just to go on Google and look up a little bit, and you immediately see it's 100% governmental, multi-governmental corporation. That's what it is. And they say, no, it's not a corporation. It's a public service organization. It's not, because if it was a public service, it would be required to be free by law, and the government wouldn't be involved. Fact of the matter is, public transit needs and should be free because it's a basic human right and necessity, and it's supposed to be a public service. A public service is always supposed to be 100% free to the general public, especially if it really is something that is a basic human right and necessity. That's what public transport must be, is not for profit, ignore profits. Let yourself go into the red if you must. Just make it free for everybody. Secondarily, in the US, another major problem, and this is actually kind of where I think a lot of people that aren't familiar kind of laugh at it because they think it's funny and bullshit, but it's true, is that it just seems unfitting, is that alongside that problem is that in the US, they're obsessed with light rail. Light rail is their hill to die on. And the way they use light rail in the US is abusive to what light rail is meant for. What light rail was meant for and built for and created for and implemented for, and always has been at its core, is for making little streetcar or trolley loops, small little tight loops around city centers, specifically in high density urban areas like Toronto or Manhattan or Chicago, or London, or Frankfurt, or Paris, or Roma, or any places like that. Tokyo is especially a good example, or a lot of the cities in China, because they're so high density around their interior cores, their downtown cores. It's meant to complement buses. It's not meant to be an alternative. It's meant to actually help buses by complementing them, going in a repetitive loop, a tiny little loop constricted to the downtown area only. That's what light rail was created for and meant for. It wasn't to be what the US uses it for, which is a hijacking of it to pretend that light rail was meant for commuter rail and intercity rail and regional rail. That's not what it's for. Light rail is called light rail because it's considered very lightweight. There's then heavy rail. That's the things like you think of with diesel engines and some electrical engines and cargo engines, or cargo train systems. Like in the US, you have Union Pacific, BNSF, and ones like that, CSX. They all use that heavy rail system. That's what those are. If you think about Amtrak, that's a heavy rail system. If you think about any of the high-speed rail networks in Europe, I want to call it Eurorail. It's not Eurorail, but anyway. The point is, all those different high-speed rail systems across Europe, those are all heavy rail. They're not light rail. Even the little intercity ones, like the Underground, is a heavy rail system. Manhattan's subway system is heavy rail. All of them are heavy rail because that's what you have to use in order to be intercity, commuter, regional rail systems, or let alone be high-speed rail. It's supposed to be heavy rails. In the US, they never do that. What they do is they decide, we're going to put light rail in. And when they say light rail, they're not talking about a streetcar system. They're talking about a commuter rail system and an intercity rail system, sometimes even a regional rail system, all on the high-speed spectrum, which is abusing and very intentionally. They know that they're misusing light rail for that purpose, and they happily do it time and time again. A big reason why this is a big problem, besides the fact it's being misused very intentionally and very, very sorely misused, is the fact that light rail there's a whole reason why I'm going to officially go into the light rail thing and just simply speak strictly on light rail here out, just until I officially start going back to the main transit subject, of why light rail is arguably the worst form of public transit you could possibly implement anywhere in the world. It's the worst possible thing unless you use it in a very high density urban area like Toronto, like Tokyo, those kind of cities, in a tiny constricted urban loop to complement bus service. Light rail is lethally expensive to build. And it especially depends on where it's being built. Like, for example, in the US, for some reason, it kind of varies sometimes city to city, metro area to metro area. I don't know why. But in the Portland area, so with TriMet, we average paying taxpayers. That's the thing in the US. They always force the taxpayers to pay for every goddamn thing public transit, which is something that we hate, especially considering they force it against their will to implement more max light rail lines. The last 2 lines, nobody wanted. And then this latest line they're proposing called the Southwest Corridor Project, which is the Purple Line Max is what they're calling it, going down Barbers Boulevard down into Tualatin. Well, it was rejected heartily. 89% of the public rejected it so hard and said, we will never accept anything light rail, but we will accept bus rapid transit, because they were sick and tired of how much we were being forced to pay and the fact that they didn't care what the public said. They would always shove off the rejected votes of the public after they do it, and then immediately switch to the corporate and elitist interests in the region to make the votes go, because they knew they were going to get the approval from them, even if the public heartily rejected it, which is what they were counting on. And it costs us on average between 7 to around $10 billion per light rail line they implement. These light rail lines average between 7 and roughly 12 miles in length. So you're almost paying $1 billion per mile of rail built. This is just the rail and the catenary and wire, which includes the wires, not just the poles. That's it. That's all that it's including. It doesn't include purchasing of the trains. It doesn't include their maintenance. It doesn't include the service. It doesn't include anything else that they need to do. It doesn't include adding signals. It doesn't include adding any of those things, which the signals incessantly fault out, as I'll explain later. But it costs $1 billion per mile on average to build out light rail lines. $1 billion, and it's the taxpayers that are forced to pay between 97.5% to about 99% of the goddamn bill, because they just refuse to pay it. And then the remainder isn't even paid by the funds or the grants or anything else from the Multi-Governmental Transport Corporation. No. It's called capital investment or capital funding from those same elites and companies and corporations in the area that are paying and that are the ones trying to force the light rail to be implemented, because it's somehow in their minds modern and looks aesthetically pleasing. It looks horrible. Who wants to look out their window or look all around and just see nothing but wires and metal poles all over the place, let alone rails and tracks? It just doesn't make any sense. At the same time, it's not modern. It's not remotely new. It's literally one of the most currently archaic and unupdated forms of transportation in the entire world. Literally. It's not updated. The last update that came was around 1950 or so, with the last update to the telearm. Specifically, what I call a telearm is actually officially called a pantograph. That's the little electrical arm that gets raised up from the top of the train and then touches and runs along the electrical wire powering the train. Though that's the latest update that system has gotten. Otherwise, it was 1920 that was the last time that the actual system itself got a proper update, rather than the vehicle. Now the vehicle's like, oh, they're changing a look. Yeah, exactly. They're changing their looks and the styling. They might take a little weight off and make it cheaper, but that's it. That's all they're doing. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. That's the only things that they're changing, so they're not actually updating the systems at all. It's one of the most archaic, ancient systems out there. And now we go into the next step of why it's a problem, and that is, if you look at all light rail systems, especially in the US, the number one thing you'll see is they're never, ever on their own kind of separate tracks from the road systems. They're always at grade, which means they're always with the roads. They're running alongside the roads, they're running parallel to the roads, they're running on the level of sidewalks and roads. They're running, therefore, across the roads, which means that there's a bunch of rail crossings with roads. That's a huge problem, especially when light rail, or rail systems in general, are a proprietary corridor system, which means that they have no adaptability. They cannot adapt, they cannot deviate, they cannot change their paths. They are fucked if something happens. somewhere on the tracks, especially at a grade crossing, they're fucked. You can't do anything. It ruins the entire system and causes it to grow stagnant. It strands the passengers wherever the hell they were, because unless they were conveniently at a station, you're stuck, because nobody can go anywhere until they clear up whatever incident occurred, whether it's a car accident with a train, or a car accident versus car accident, or somebody committed suicide or whatever else. That's when, guess what? They bring in the buses to go and act as a shuttle bus. But again, if you're stuck in a train that wasn't at a station, say in between stations, and you're not at a road area or a path area, then you're just stuck inside of this random bit of rail track and private property. And safety requirements and laws say that you can't let those passengers off your train. So they're just stranded until the system is able to be brought back online. That's why another reason why light rail is such a toxic and horrible form of transportation that nobody should ever be willing to implement, because you're utterly fucked. And guess what the best form of transportation is? Buses. And guess what? That's exactly what they have to use in order to take those passengers that were relying on the trains that actually were at stations, fortunately for them, to be able to get off and then get on those shuttle buses to then get out to those places. Then again, it depends on how motivated those transit corporations are to actually send out shuttle buses. Let alone, it depends on how motivated they are to actually make sure that they get them out there as soon as possible. A lot of times here in the land of Trimat, you have to wait sometimes upwards of an hour before the first shuttle bus comes to pick up passengers at a station, because that's how unmotivated Trimat tends to be. At the same time, we move on to the next reason it's a major problem, is the fact that since it's so archaic, it has so many inherent severe issues. From the fact that it can be screwed up and delays can grow to over an hour plus because of bridge lift issues, because of mainly, this is the most common one, switch issues. The train switches have such constant issues. And people that are like, well, guess what? Light rail's not as problematic or has as many switch issues as heavy rail, like the cargo lines. Okay, so you can shut up. The fact of the reality is that's a lie. That's a bald-faced lie. They're lying to themselves and lying to everybody else when they say that. That's absolutely provably false. When you look at the statistics and the data for hundreds, if not thousands of miles of cargo line rails, okay, and then you look at, and even high-speed passenger rail lines, which are hundreds and thousands of miles, even in the US, and then you compare it to one little proprietary little light rail system inside of a city or metro area. In comparison, you maybe have, like somewhere between 25 to 100 miles of rail versus 500 to like 4,000 miles of rail for one line. These cargo lines and high-speed passenger lines that are extensively long ones, they average so much, intensely so much fewer decay issues, so much fewer switch issues primarily, and even fewer bridge lift issues than light rail lines do in these tiny little proprietary areas of 25 to maybe 100 miles of track at most. That's it. Like, they average so few that it's actually, in comparison, unheard of, practically, to actually be held up by a switch issue on a high-speed rail line that's hundreds, if not thousands of miles long. Whereas the light rail lines, they average between roughly 8 to upwards of 25, 30 switch issues per day. It's horrible. And this is on a tiny little set of lines, amongst other problems that cause severe delays, and obviously force out shuttle buses because of the fact that you can so easily get stranded when you're on a proprietary little corridor that you can't deviate. You can't take a detour. You can't do anything because you're stuck where you are, no matter what you do. Which again, we keep going back to that because that is arguably the number one reason why you should never do it, besides obviously the price tag being just indisputably immorally high. That they would, especially to make people pay for it. That's just disgusting. And so another reason why it's a problem is because of the fact that, god damn it, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And usually, I mean, I even tweet about it a lot. I've written about it a lot. Just lists, commented about it a lot on YouTube. Just the extensive lists long. And it's just painful how long that list is of why light rail is a negative and not a positive. Now, this is, instead of going on for an on and on with that list, I'm actually going to now start making the transition point, which is about why light rail is still bad and why buses are better. So if you go and look at the amount of people that a light rail vehicle can hold. In the US, there's laws in place that say that a light rail car can only be 2 cars long. So you have the A car and the B car. You'll always see that with the numbering on a light rail car in any US system. So A is obviously the front, supposed to be the front, and B is supposed to be the back. There's just 2 cars, and all total at crush load is what it's called, which is rush hour, when you're basically shoving yourself into a sardine tin where everybody's inside of each other's bodies practically, because it's so freaking crowded and overloaded. That's called crush load. They can hold between roughly 140 to 160 passengers. Another problem with that is the fact that the light rails in the US, again, there's another law in place, which is that they can only be within at most a mile of each other, so end to end. So that's the front of one light rail vehicle and then the back end of another. They have to be, at closest, they can only be up to 5,280 feet. In other words, a mile between the front of one vehicle and the back end of another. That's as close as they're allowed to be by law. When that's the case, you have to then look at the buses, specifically in a bus rapid transit system, or BRT. Light rail transit, obviously, is LRT. In case anybody didn't know that, there's a little detail for you in case next time you look at something like that, you're like, oh, that's what that is. Yeah. We're talking about light rail transit versus bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit systems are ones that have proprietary bus-only lanes. Usually they have priority at intersections, so traffic signals, and they can actually freaking detour. They also almost exclusively use articulated and or double-decker buses. Articulated buses can hold at crush load 240 to 280 passengers versus 140 to 280 passengers in a light rail vehicle. At the same time, if they run the bus rapid transit system at an optimal distancing between each other and the rush hour crush load times, they can be within 500 feet of each other. That's the most efficient use and spacing at rush hour crush load, there you go, for bus rapid transit systems. Which means your buses are coming like every 5 to 8 minutes. And on top of that, they're within 500 places. And you can hold, usually at crush load, around in between 60 to about 100, 110 more people per bus. And instead of being 5,280 feet apart, like a light rail system would have to be, they can be up to 500 feet apart. And with a bus-only lane and priority at intersections and traffic signals, they're going to be a lot more consistent, a lot more frequent, and they're not going to be bogged down by traffic remotely as much. And they're not going to have inhibitions like a light rail system does, where if something happens on the system or involving the system, everybody gets stranded and all the trains get stuck until they fix it, because light rail is on a proprietary corridor. With buses, they can make detours at any point in time. So if some major accident or incidents ahead of them on the route, all they have to do is divert just a little bit and get around it, and then they can go back online. That's all they have to do. And then all the organization, the transit organization, has to do is, as soon as that's reported by the first bus driver who encounters it, they officially issue that official detour out into the public sphere, so that hopefully those passengers at those stops waiting know they need to go to a block or 2 or 3 over in order to catch the bus. It's that simple. It's super, super efficient. Light rail transit, you can't do that. You cannot detour. You're just stuck and you're fucked no matter what until they fix it. Buses, they can detour because they're not stuck on a proprietary corridor. That is, unless you do the most illogical thing, which is have quote-unquote trolley buses, which are effectively 50% light rail, 50% bus, because they're stuck on a proprietary corridor using their pantographs, to power the bus in order to keep going, and that's their route is fixed to a pantograph, so a catenary line, which is highly illogical. Like, why would you ever bind two forms of transit, let alone why would you bind those two together? That makes the least amount of sense. You take away and rob the bus of its flexibility by requiring it to use catenary wires and a pantograph? That just makes no fucking sense. I don't understand why people are so obsessive with that. It makes no goddamn sense. It absolutely makes no fucking sense. If you believe in that, and if you like it, and if you advocate for it, and you think it's good, fuck you. That's what I have to say to you. Fuck you. Because you are twisted in the head and you need some serious mental help, because that is not something that a mentally stable person would support. I'm sorry. It's just a fact. That's the only way that a bus rapid transit system is no longer a bus rapid transit system and gets fucked, is because somebody thought for some reason that made sense, which it doesn't fucking make a sense. Anywhere, any place, anytime, ever, for any reason. It's never going to make sense. Those things need to be nuclearly detonated from existence. They're that heinous of a crime that they ever got created. That's my personal opinion on that. In comparison, that's a big benefit. And I'm actually going to go back to light rail again, because there's another important thing, especially this time of year. It's really important to mention it, especially considering all the polar vortex and all the snow and all the winter weather stuff that's been happening across the U.S. this year. It's in this winter, I should say. It's so incredibly imperative to mention this, is that light rail systems automatically shut down because they cannot function if it's too cold, too hot, too rainy. They can't function if there's too much snow. They can't function if there's very much water. They can't function if it's, gets too hot and sunny. They just can't function in almost any weather event that's going to happen multiple times a year, no matter where you are in the US. That's how bad of a system it is. It either completely shuts down, or with the heat, it can completely shut down, or it goes on a requirement, again by law, it goes on a requirement of a top speed of 30 miles an hour. And if you think about that, if you're using something like, say, here in TriMet Land, you're going from, say, the Hatfield Center in Hillsborough all the way to, I don't know, PDX, so the airport, it's going to take you, instead of averaging the typical, probably hour and 15 to hour and 45 minutes to get there, it's probably going to now take you about somewhere between, I'd say, 3 3/4 to 6 hours to get there, going 30 miles an hour on that train. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would you implement a system that's that easily faulted, that's that easily shut down, it's so, why is that a tongue twister today, that is so easily ruined and just screwed with, that you think it's a good idea to spend billions of dollars per mile implementing it? It just doesn't make any goddamn sense. Which that does bring me to my next thing, is that the reason why it's a hill to die on that all these big name major metro area transit systems are using as their hill to die on, is because of the fact that it's causing mass gentrification. And as developers and city councilors and mayors and all this other stuff will keep trying to push, along with the transit agencies, government basically, and elites and corporations that want it, are of course going to push it as this great, positive, wonderful thing that they call development, specifically economic development. There's a big difference between development, a huge difference in fact, between development and gentrification. Development is simply any kind of a non-motivated building. So if you're building an apartment complex, but it's for low and affordable income, that's not gentrification, that's development. If you're just building single family homes, that's development. As long as it's, truly single family homes, it's not some big high-end neighborhood. It's just, typical middle or lower class neighborhood that you're building, that's just development. Now, if it's economically motivated to where you're trying to get basically anyone from upper middle class through the high class people in there, then that's gentrification, because you're making it much higher end, higher quality, much fancier, much more quote-unquote hip and popular, whatever's the most popular things, whatever is so considered so hip, which right now is big-time tech, coffee, random pastry shops, things like that, arts districts. That's what's currently considered super trendy. So that's gentrification. That's what's happening to Portland. That's what's been happening to all the other areas that have implemented light rail systems. You start seeing not development that they promote it as, but gentrification. Gentrification is economic economically motivated, and it's also racially motivated. As in, they're both a form of basically what would be considered economic and racial warfare. They're trying to oust the blacks, and they're trying to oust the Hispanics and anyone else who's not basically white or Asian out of the neighborhood. Well, specifically, they're trying to oust them out of the major main city and main core of the metro area, which is, of course, the big city. In this case, this is Portland. They're trying to push them all out into the suburbs as far away as they can so they can get their young, hip, white, trendy, techie people, young, white, techie people, yeah, into the city, along with their high-tech Asian minds as well, into the city and push everybody else out. And economically, that's one of the main ways they do that, is because they want to make it as hip, trendy, and thus expensive as fuck as they can. And that's exactly what light rail does for them. It implements and causes gentrification. Now in Portland, the big thing that people keep missing with it is that it's used, and thus it's used for that, which causes all the other crises we're having in the city and in the metro area now. We've been having a major housing crisis and cost of living crisis, as in rental crisis, basically. In other words, rents through the fucking roof. Housing prices are through the roof. Cost of living keeps growing and skyrocketing, just like the rent and the cost, and the housing prices. That crisis is a direct result of that gentrification. That was the direct result of the implementation of the light rail system. From there, you go from the housing crisis, and then there's another thing, another branch, another thing the light rail's gentrification is directly causing, and that is the homeless crisis to go through the roof. With gentrification, you immediately have the housing crises, the cost of living crisis, the rent and thus housing crisis, because rent should be with the housing crisis, so I'll just specify that there, and then the homeless crises. They all go suddenly through the fucking roof like nobody's business as soon as you start to gentrify. That's why Portland's had these crises suddenly go through the roof, is because of the gentrification that was caused by the light rail. This is why also all the elites, and especially the big companies in the area, especially the tech companies, desperately want and always use light rail as their hill to die on. They'll always funnel their capital into these black hole projects where they just throw it into it, and it's just like a black hole. It just disappears from existence. Nobody can trace where the capital funding went. Nobody knows where it went. It just goes away. And it's a boondoggle or a pork barrel or whatever the heck you want to call it that this group of people like me always refer to it as a pork barrel, boondoggle. As just simply a scam and sham, if you want to go real simplistic, all that stuff. People don't want to believe it, and most importantly, they don't see it. They don't realize that this is the problem, is the light rail. That's in the US what it's used for. That's why they want it so badly. When you look at places like Tampa Bay area, so you look at Tampa and St. Petersburg and the surrounding area, so Hillsborough and Pinellas counties, their transportation has been historically absolutely goddamn abhorrent. Just despicably, especially if you're having about as many people in their metro area as we do here in the Portland. They are so despicably non-existent in their transportation infrastructure and transportation in general. There's like nothing there. And even with the ones that are there, it sucks more than I can explain. And one of the main reasons why, of course, is funding problems. One of the ways they wanted to try and get that funding and try to, quote-unquote, improve transportation is get light rail down there. They tried that since 1970. They've been trying to force light rail in, and everybody's constantly rejected it. One of the major reasons why people keep rejecting all that stuff down there is because they know that, well, they know exactly why they want the light rail. They know it's not going to help them transportation-wise at all. It's to gentrify it. That's not going to help the people that are going to use the public transportation at all, because as much as I hate to say it, the main people who use public transit consistently and have to rely on it are exactly the working class people. They're the blue collar, but more specifically, the poorer you are, the more you rely on public transportation, on public services. That's what public transportation is a public service. Therefore, it is the more ran-down communities that are using their transportation system down there, just like anywhere else. They know that, and they know that their transportation system sucks, And they know that Pinellas County is pretty damn famous for being really shitty at the moment and extensively ran down. Nobody really has any ability to get to their jobs anymore unless they like basically spend almost their entire 24-hour days conscious because they have to do errands, they have to take care of themselves, they have to pay their bills, they have to do this, they have to do that before they can go to bed after work. But it also takes them on average 2 hours to get to work or from work. Well, I shouldn't say or, I should say and. So they spend 4 hours transport using public transportation, bouncing line to line to finally get to wherever they work, usually in downtown Tampa or St. Pete. And then from there, they have to go all the way back out to where they live, which is predictably the far out suburbs. Because, duh, that's of course where you're going to be. And most of these workers, obviously, are outside the Clearwater, St. Petersburg area, because, especially Clearwater, that's one of the more expensive neighborhoods in the entire area. That's where a lot of the rich assholes live, and where a lot of the big mansion-like places are and stuff like that. Well, the more quote-unquote privileged people, I guess you could call them, especially economically. You could definitely say they're privileged. But Clearwater's that kind of place, and that's just north. It's the next city north of St. Pete. So most of these people are north and especially northeast of and east of Tampa. And it's really sad to see that they have to go all the way across the entire city, and sometimes all the way across the city and through the city to get to St. Petersburg, somewhere in St. Petersburg to work sometimes too, using the system that practically doesn't even exist in the first place. And they know what the light rail's for and what it's only exclusively used for in the US. They're smart enough to pay attention, be well aware of that, and know that since the 70s. And they have not touched it. And they've been even less willing to touch it since, especially considering it's billions of dollars per rail line. Who the fuck would support that? Especially if you're having the funding problems and these people are unwilling to pay taxes, good for them by the way, to implement their transportation infrastructure. How do you think that's going to work? Especially considering they've been vocally against that since 1970. And they are especially against it now. They shot it down every single time they tried it the last 3-4 years. Again, great job for you guys. You're an exceptionally, deeply, intensely rare gem of well-aware people of what that's really trying to do. And now supposedly they're going to officially finally get bus rapid transit systems implemented, supposedly. But they are going to require, obviously, these people to be taxed and pay for that. And these people, if you stay aware enough down there, guys, I hope you do, you're going to read the fine print of each and every proposal and bill that's put out there transportation-wise. Because if it's anything like the Portland Metro in 1978, they're going to put it in the fine print that they're actually going to use the most amount of funding for light rail. And then they're also going to put in that fine print, oh, by the way, you revoke your rights to actually have really any say. And if we implement them or not, you're just going to pay for them anyway. Because we're going to make them happen anyway. Enjoy. That's basically what they did here with TriMet in 1978. Basically, it was a light rail bill, but they posed it as a bus improvement and transportation expansion bill. Without actually mentioning it in the main thing at all, that it was really light rail implemented. They suggested it as an idea, but they're just like, oh, it's just a concept we're toying with. We'll be sure to ask you. That got all the votes passed, and everybody up here has regretted it ever since. So if you guys paid close attention down there, always read every goddamn word to a T, if not multiple times over, and especially any fine print, and really be a jackass and be as arrogantly prying and forceful with prying and asking all the pestering questions to the officials. What are you hiding? What are you hiding? What are you hiding? What are you hiding? What else is in here? What does this mean? In other words, make sure you annoy them until the point where they have no choice but to give you the answer that you're looking for. Because you know that they're going to be hiding something. Because if that's the hill they're to die on, and then suddenly they're just suddenly let go of it completely and like, oh, we're only going to do bus rapid transit. Yep, that's all we're going to do. We accept you guys as push. There's something very wrong with that picture to just suddenly flip in an instant and be like, no, actually, we've always been supportive of this. No, you fucking haven't. What are you hiding? Make sure you do that. If it doesn't have anything in that, then that's a first ever in U.S. history, transportation-wise, and I really, really, really really encourage you guys to accept that and make it pass at that point. So getting back to the benefits now of bus rapid transit. Again, bus only lanes. Huge benefit. At the same time, priority at signals. Traffic signals, hopefully. Always, that is. And then, of course, the fact that you run them truly frequently. Not 15 minutes or less, but be as precise as you can. So say between 5 to 10 minutes at rush hour, and then between 10 and 15 minutes the rest of the day. For the most heavily used lines, obviously that's what you want to make into bus rapid transit systems. The ones where it has the most demand, the most people that are going to use it. Always use articulated double-deckers, of course, as well. Another benefit is the fact that, again, unlike light rail, it's not a proprietary corridor. So if anything fucks up its route, it can just do a simple detour. As if nothing ever happened, and then slink itself back on track. That's all the buses have to do. They just detour. Go around whatever the problem is, and they're good. There's another benefit, which is the fact that not only can it hold so many more people, and can they be so much closer, and that's so much more frequent. And again, the primary, bus-only lanes with just priority of signals. But you also have the benefit of the fact that it costs, on average, for, say, implementing 5 different bus rapid transit lines, it costs usually around upwards of between $250 to $500 million to implement that many. So basically, usually it's really around between $400 and $500 million to implement 5 different bus rapid transit lines. That means that it's about $100 million per. It seems expensive, but at the same time, the benefit of that is intense. Whereas with light rail, you're not paying $100 million per line, and each bus rapid transit line would probably be anywhere between roughly 8 to 15, sometimes upwards of 20, 25 miles at most in length. You're paying $1 billion on average for each mile of simple track laying and catenary pole and wire building. $1 billion on average per mile for light rail, but only $100 million per, multiple miles between 8 and 20 miles of a bus rapid transit line that can run within 500 feet of each other rather than 50 to 180 feet. So instead of, an entire mile having to be in between them, and you can run within 500 feet of each other. They are not stuck in a proprietary corridor, so you're not stranded if, God forbid, something happens along its line. It's far cheaper to implement, as I keep repeating myself. It has the benefit of holding over 100 more people at crush load. And again, they're within 500 feet of each other rather than an entire mile of each other. I mean, and it doesn't have traffic problems because they're bus-only lanes and priority at intersections and traffic signals. And it just, you're paying $100 million per line for that versus, $1 billion per mile of simple track and catenary for light rail. I mean, obviously, light rail is the worst possible choice you could make, and the best possible is bus rapid transit. Buses. Buses are the goddamn answer, and they're the future, even though they're also really old. They're the future of transportation. They've had a major resurgence around the world for good reason. They are the future. They are adaptable. They are detourable. They are able to shift, change, and adapt depending on the situation you have at hand. That's a massive benefit. Whereas rail can never do that. It cannot adapt. It cannot change. It cannot alter its route or anything. It's fucked if something happens. I cannot keep reiterating all this stuff enough. So never support light rail, always support buses. That's the moral of the story here. And if you don't want major skyrocketing in your rent and housing costs and costs of living, and you don't want to become a major tech hub or become this great hip trendy place with a lot of expensive skyscrapers and stuff, you don't want to support light rail. It's the worst possible thing you could do to yourself and everybody else around you. Don't fucking touch light rail ever. That's one of the #1 reasons why transportation sucks in the US. Another reason, obviously, is the fact that not only they're wasting money on that and then high-speed rail projects and stupid things like Hyperloop and stuff, but they're also wasting their money on implementing new things and new infrastructure rather than fixing the existing ones. That's one of the biggest problems, is they never fix that. And they also never focus on the buses. Buses can go anywhere and everywhere you want to take them, and you could take them. Trains can't do that. They absolutely cannot do that. They are stuck going in a proprietary corridor. And everybody has some form of trains, usually light rail in the US, stuck as their hill to die on. Hill to die on is the US term for, in other words, they refuse to back down from it. That's the only, that's like literally the thing, you call it hill to die on because it's literally, you stand up on this hill, put it up on a pedestal and say, this is it. And I will die saying this is our only opportunity. This is our only choice and we better damn well accept it. I will happily get shot and killed up here. I will happily die, insisting that there's only one path, only one way, only one narrow corridor we have to force ourselves through. I won't accept anything else. That's what hill to die on is meaning, is indicating. And that's what, in transport, that's what they're obsessed with right now. That and other forms of rail. For some reason, I don't understand it. This is the primary reasons why U.S. transportation sucks hardly, to an extent I can't explain. And also why places like TriMet are used as the prime example of what never to accept, what never to do in a transportation, for transportation ever, for any reason whatsoever. You might as well rather just shoot yourself and kill yourself than accept what TriMet has done, specifically light rail. And the best and my favorite prime example of that is looking at Canberra, Australia, because they've had this constant boondoggle, pork barrel, light rail debacle down there incessantly that the citizens have been fighting as hard as they can against what they call the ACT government, which is what they have doing their transportation down there and ignoring them, of course. And they constantly are using experiences of the TriMet system. They're using experiences with the light rail system. They're using a lot of experienced light rail operators and bus operators and just people that were working for TriMet at one point or are still, or people that are, of course, relying on TriMet. And unfortunately, sometimes their best choice is to use the Max line as much as they hate supporting it and all this other stuff. It's a big thing in Canberra to use TriMet as the prime example of what never to do, which is funny because all the big name cities and big elitist corporations and stuff around the world keep using TriMet as what to do and the best thing you can do for your transportation system in the city, but the people aren't using it as that. No, that's the people are using it as the worst thing you can do. It's the governments and the corporations and those vested interests in light rail that are the ones that are promoting it as this like godsend of transportation, this supposed, as TriMet likes to advertise themselves for some fucked up reason, the transportation mecca of the world, which is utter bullshit. I cannot possibly express how insanely offensive that is to try and say they're the mecca of the world, or even that they're in the top half of transportation systems in the world. They are not. They are rock bottom along with every single other U.S. transportation system in the world. Rock bottom in the world of transportation systems. I mean, you could probably go to Kyrgyzstan or to Tibet, China. As much as I hate saying Tibet's in China. Tibet, China. And you could go to those places and you'd probably find yourself with a more high quality and reliable transit system than you would, and extensive, than you would here in the U.S. It's that bad. Yeah, I could go on and on for hours and hours about this. And I've actually been recording this now for almost an hour, for just under 30 minutes at this very moment in time. I love talking about transportation, and I love ranting about it, and I love thinking about it and all this other stuff, because again, my entire life I've been so goddamn into it. But since I could go on and on, I will not anymore, and I hope at some point in the future I can actually get people like Al and like maybe even Eric or any of these other people that I have grown to basically be friends with, and we're basically what we call TriMet watchdogs and transport. We're all transportation nuts in our own right, in our own ways, and so it would be really cool to kind of get one or two or a handful of these people on to just actually have a multi-person episode of CHATTERBOX talking about not just TriMet obviously, but U.S. transportation in general. I will leave this off with one more thing about U.S. transportation, and that is looking at Seattle and looking at, well, actually really just looking at Seattle. Seattle is probably the best transportation system in the entire nation. It's still not saying much, but it's one of the best ones out there. especially bus related wise. And now a lot of people in Seattle, of course, will say, actually, we're one of the worst in the nation, just like we do here, and just like you will in Atlanta or in Kansas City or New York or in Boston. MBTA is notoriously hideous. If you're in Miami or if you're in New Orleans, if you're in Dallas, if you're in Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you're in Chicago, if you're in LA and the surrounding areas, other transportation districts, if you're in San Francisco, basically the whole Bay Area system, if you're in any of that region or any of these places, all of us will tell you that we have the worst transportation system in the entire world, if not the entire country. And everybody, all of the other cities say, no, you're wrong. We have the worst one, of course, because that's kind of how this works. I personally think that TransMet is the worst system. A lot of people say that if you've been to Kansas City, or you've been to Atlanta, or you've been to any of these other places, MBTA land, which is, of course, again, Boston, they'll tell you that actually you'll experience that it's by far the worst. And TransMet's probably one of the best in the nation. And I shudder. Absolutely shudder. I basically almost said shudder. I basically shudder at that concept that somehow we could be one of the best in the nation. It's actually almost offensive that would be the case. And I don't accept that at all. Like, even if I went down to experience it and study it and make sure I relied on it to do everything for a long time, I would, in multiple different these places that are said to be, far worse, if not the worst in the nation, I would do that happily, and I would keep going back to comparing it to TransMet, because that way I could get, in my mind, an accurate representation, realistically, of which one's worse or better. Which would be kind of cool to then have a tier system of like tiering who's best of the group to the worst. Again, to all international people, don't think that means that some of these systems are actually good. They're horrid, absolutely unacceptably abhorrent. It's just that we only really have our own systems to compare each other to, which is not saying anything. It's absolutely one of the worst things out there. Yeah, Seattle's is probably one of the best. And the reason why a lot of Seattle residents say that their bus system is actually shitty and that their transportation system is probably one of the worst in the nation is because of the fact that for some reason they felt it was smart, especially in Seattle, downtown specifically, for some reason, and in the tourism districts, to put bus stops like a block apart, while their blocks are some of the smallest out of all the big major cities in the nation. Like, they're really short, like 100 feet. So bus stations are like 100 to 125 feet apart. And they're using like articulated buses a lot. And they also run so many different bus lines to these stops that you have so many different buses that then like clog up intersections and clog up the entire like blocks worth of space, where they're just back to back to back to back to back, and they're delaying each other because of the fact that, they're just... It's a horror show in that sense. That, I will give them, it makes no fucking sense that you did that, especially if you're going to use articulated buses. Why the hell would you do that? Let alone, it makes no goddamn logical sense to put bus stops every block. TriMet's rule is like put it like every 2 blocks roughly. I wouldn't even do that. I would like put bus, especially if it's a bus rapid transit system or you want it to be reliable, you want to put bus stations, bus stops like every, I'd say 3 blocks is probably the most optimal way of spacing you could put, is every 3 blocks in the downtown core. And then if you could run just about every line as its own independent rapid transit system, even better. And the thing is that if you want to have multiple lines connect and put each other together, one, prioritize and figure out and pre-plan where you're going to put each of your transit centers, where the highest demand is, and thus where each of the places you want to make multiple lines converge at, so people can swap lines with ease and go wherever they need to go. You need to put a transit center there, not a motherfucking stop. That makes no sense, and then have all these different lines share it at the same time. It makes no sense, especially in a downtown street. Who the hell thought that made any lick of sense? It doesn't make the least bit of logical sense. It's the worst type of transportation planning you could possibly have. And then from there, if you still want to make a transfer, but there's no transit station, say there's only 2 lines that are gonna actually end up converging, and that's you'd swap from at an intersection. Make sure that they're crossing each other, so the lines are crossing each other, and they're going in different directions. So one line, say, is going northbound, and one line's going east. And so, say, my favorite and the most logical form of a bus system's line would be what I call a two-way one-way or a two-way route. To me, it's a two-way route. It's officially, it's considered a one-way loop. Yeah, it's considered a one-way loop, which, yeah, I guess technically is one way, but I consider it two ways because you're going both, say, for example, north and south. You just happen at one terminus you happen to start at and then go north, end at another terminus, and then use that terminus or transit center to turn around, and then come back down the same road again and mirror each other. To me, that's still a two-way, so I call it a two-way loop, but it's officially called a one-way loop. Anyway, to me that makes the most sense. So especially when you're crossing those two lines, that's when it makes the most sense, because now you have a stop at the intersection going east and westbound. Obviously on opposite sides of the intersection you have those stops right before you actually cross the intersections. That's the most logical placement for them. And then at the same time, same with going north and south. You have one on the south side of the intersection going northbound, but you have one on the north side of the intersection going southbound. That way, no matter which way the people are going on that route, they can make an easy transfer without clogging up transit and having, and all the vehicles and everything else, and having this backup of buses. It just doesn't make any sense. So prioritize the transit centers, and then at those kind of convergences where you really feel the need to cross these two lines, well, you're going to cross them. Just put the stops at each side of the intersection, depending on which place the bus is going or coming from, and you have easy transfers. All they have to do is use a crosswalk maybe once or twice, and that's it. And they're good. Like, that's all you'd have to do. It's super simplistic. It's easy. It's the most logical and efficient way to do it, and practical way. So Seattle, I give you that credit. That doesn't make any sense. And yes, obviously, especially in a high-density city like Seattle, that's going to cause a utter fuck up of a horror show traffic-wise. I completely get where you're coming from with that. But no, that doesn't make your system one of the worst in the nation. It doesn't make it bad. It actually makes it just makes it have its own fuck up. Like every other system has its number one major fuck up. That's yours. And to that, you guys still have arguably the best system in the entire nation by far. And the main reason why is because of the fact that they always focus on the buses and the bus system there, expanding it, improving it, rearranging certain routes to make it more reliable and quicker, and you get the picture. Just all these different details are covered depending on how they adapt the lines, how they change them around, how they shift certain things, how they take away certain lines but then add others, or just simply adding others. You get the idea. That's what your transportation groups do up there. Because, of course, you have two. You have Sound Transit, but you also have King County. Those are your two primary ones. There's going to be the people on the north side that are like, excuse me, we have multiple stuff here. Okay, we have Snohomish County, and we also have Everett. I'm highly offended by this. You can go fuck yourself. But, yeah, so Sound Transit, King County Transit, those two seem to have pretty much gotten it down pat with bus services, which is really cool. Other than what they have there. And obviously, being so elitistly motivated development-wise, and having all these skyscrapers that are now so iconic, and all these plazas and other things that are iconic, especially the tourism industry, they have no goddamn place downtown Seattle that they'd ever be willing to or ever be able to put a transportation station, unless maybe they built one underground, which I hate the concept in the north of putting underground anything in the Northwest or having tunnels in the Northwest. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's a completely different story on its own. So I'll avoid that. But yeah, if you did that, then yeah, maybe they could put one downtown, underground. That would then help alleviate a lot of the problems, I think. As long as they could figure out the entrances and exits properly to where it hopefully doesn't fuck up traffic anymore. Or maybe give them priority for at least exiting the transit center, I feel like, maybe? I don't know. It's rough to figure out that sort of stuff, especially when everything's already built. Typical US thing. They pre-build everything, and then they realize how much that's a fuck up itself, and how much it didn't make sense, and how much they ruined everything. Yeah, go figure. Welcome to the United States, where they don't make any fucking sense. They don't use their brains, they just do. Anyway, I could go. That's another different story. I could go on there. Yeah, so Seattle, you guys have a good benefit. I am not trusting in ST3 or Sound Transit Bill 3, because that's heavily emphasizing light rail implementation and expansion, and that I can just about guarantee you guys are going to sorely regret Because once they really start properly having expanded the system with a lot more lines and a lot more, lengthened current lines and stuff, you guys are probably going to start to see the same kind of thing that happened here happen up there. And that's really going to suck for everybody up there. And it's going to hurt us a lot. It kind of already did when you guys refused to listen to us, because there's so many people down here that were screaming and crying out to you, or just pleading with you guys to listen to us for once and actually see what we strongly regretted from accepting a bill that was pretty much an exact replica. That your ST3 was an exact replica of what we had in 1978 that we passed. And so we're pretty sure you guys just fucked up. And you guys did not want to listen to us or tell us, did not even care that we said that. Like, oh, we trust our government more than you do, so fuck you. And it's like, well, then you're going to tell you, well, basically, in other words, we're just like, well, don't come crying back to us once you realize we were right. And you were wrong, and you fucked up. Because we warned you, we told you, we did everything we could to get you guys to listen to us, to realize you made a dire error if you signed and they prove that. You did it anyway. It's you who fucked up, not us. Don't you dare come crying back to us when you realize we were right. Don't even talk to us that we were right. Tell us we were right. We already know we're right, and we're going to be really irritated and say, excuse me? Who are you, and why the fuck should we care? Because you guys didn't listen to us, and that's what you're saying to us now. You wish you did. And you know what? We don't care anymore. Because you didn't care to listen to us, we don't care to listen to your complaints. Go fuck yourself. We already know how it is. So, yeah. But anyway, that's the end of this episode of Chatterbox. This is going to be a horror to edit, if I edit it all. Because I didn't really take too many breaks. There's like 2 points where I took a fairly lengthy break that I'll probably cut a little bit out of. And some stuttering points I'll cut out. But otherwise, I don't think I'm going to edit this much, which means this is probably going to just about guaranteed to be just over an hour long episode. Which I think if anybody knows me well enough, especially if they see stuff on Twitter, they know that this is a subject that I was always guaranteed to make an episode on, while also probably taking over an hour to speak about it. So, hey, I did exactly what everybody was expecting of me. But yeah, so I hope you guys got the gist of this. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think about all this down below. And heck, let me know if you're reliant on transportation, and if so, how much, and where you're at, and how bad or good you think your transportation system is. I would love to hear the horror stories. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about your transit systems, what you think about them, what the problems are, what the things that make you want to practically shoot yourself are because of how intolerable it is, etc., etc., etc. I would love to hear about that, and especially if you're international, I would love to hear your guys' perspective on what a lot of us have been saying, what I've said here about our transit systems. And especially if you've pretty persistently ridden one or a handful of our systems, and I mean like say a week straight you just simply took our systems in a city or two, or even just one. I would love to know your experience with that and what you thought about it and what you heard from people there, and then in comparison to where you live elsewhere. That would be really cool. And I'd love to know and hear about what other people think about potential solutions or anything like that. Just basically anything on this topic. I would love to be able to be engaging with you people and know what you guys think about this topic and your systems and all that stuff. So, otherwise, yeah, be sure to leave a like if you guys did enjoy it. You guys got the gist of it. Because it lets me know that you guys did enjoy it and that you guys did get the gist of it. I really strongly appreciate that, because it's very helpful for me to know that I am producing content that you guys enjoy. Even though primarily I'm doing this just because I've always wanted to do it, and because I do enjoy it myself, and I talk too much, as you can tell. Yeah, it's just something that I wanted to do, and so I'm doing it. So it doesn't really matter as much to me as it used to about if people enjoy what I'm doing or not. But it still is an important part of this, and it still is an important part to me deep down. Like, what I still would love to know if people are enjoying this, because it means so much to me if the people do and all that, and especially if they get engaged, they start engaging in it and start to, let me know their thoughts and let me know, what their point of views and topics and things like that. So, blah 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 blah, world's longest outro. So yes, but otherwise, yeah, feel free to share it around wherever, whenever, to whoever, to your dog, to your cat, to your crazy uncle, to that random hobo that just can't stop picking at his scabs. Probably my brother Nathan. What? Anyway, and yeah. Hope to see you in the next episode and or the next video. Stay safe, stay epic and fluffy, have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you later. This has been CHATTERBOX, and bye-bye.